This week, we're looking at temptation. Have you ever seen this old German story about these two troublemakers, Max and Moritz? I'd be surprised if you were familiar with them. Really surprised. Let me say up front, this story is pretty crazy. Max and Moritz, the two boys, they pull all kinds of terrible pranks, like don't try this at home, kind of terrible. They kill an old widow's chickens. They saw through a wooden bridge so some poor guy falls through into the water. They fill this other dude's pipe with gunpowder while he's playing the organ at church. And you can imagine what ends up happening. And in a twisted turn of events, Max and Moritz meet a cruel fate when they're ground up at the mill and fed to ducks at the end. I'm serious, this is one crazy story. But at the end of it all, their victims are all gathered together in the village talking about the deeds of the two rascals. And they talk about the mischief making they had done, the cruel jokes they had played, and the poor guy that fell through the bridge because of Max and Moritz. He says, at least in the English version of this story, he says, none but self to blame. He says Max and Moritz have only themselves to blame for their fate. They asked for it. They made all those bad decisions. They deserve all the blame. But do they? Are they entirely to blame? Where are their parents in all this? Why isn't anyone giving these kids the attention they need and giving their lives some needed structure and supervision? The boys obviously could have used some attention and positive influences. Can we really expect them to resist these temptations, to do all this bad stuff? Are Max and Moritz the victims here to some degree? They were tempted to do all that bad stuff, and they did it. They did it. But who is to blame? Who should shoulder the blame for them giving in to the temptations of these dastardly deeds? Who? And today, we're talking about blame. Temptation and blame. We're talking about it because James is talking about it. Here's James 1:13. Let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. James is talking about temptation, and this time, temptation actually means temptation. He's not talking about trials like he was back in verse 2 and verse 12. He means temptation, enticement to sin. And James says that when you're tempted, don't blame God. Don't blame God for tempting you. Don't do it. But if you think about it from your own experience with temptation, if by chance, just hypothetically, if you've ever been tempted before, do you ever blame God? Do you? Who blames God?
I don't blame myself. I don't blame myself. I don't blame myself.
It's not my fault.
I don't blame
Don't go blaming it on me. Don't go blaming it on me.
I don't blame you.
I blame myself. I blame myself.
I don't blame myself.
Who blames God? Who blames God when they're tempted? Do you? Do you blame God when you're tempted? God clearly thought we needed to be told not to blame him. He even builds a case in the next verse why he's not to blame. God can't be tempted with evil. God doesn't tempt any man. That's a pretty solid explanation for why we would be wrong to blame God for tempting us to sin. God just can't be tempted to do evil, and God just doesn't tempt anyone. Okay, why is James telling us this stuff? Why is he even talking about temptation right now? He was just talking about rich people and poor people. But it's kind of a natural flow, considering he has been talking about trials and how God uses them to mature the Christian. If God brings those trials into our lives, we might think it's the same for temptations. It's the same word for both trials and temptations. But James says, au contraire.
Au contraire.
Not so fast. To be sure, God does test us. And God does allow temptation into our lives. But he doesn't tempt us by leading us into sin. He just doesn't do it. So who should we blame? Not God. It's not God who's to blame for our temptations. It's our own desires. That's what verse 14 says. We're dragged away and lured by our own desires to sin. And then in verse 15, James gives us this genealogical sequence of 3 generations. Desire becomes pregnant and gives birth to sin, and then sin gives birth to death. The end result of death makes the whole idea of giving into temptation take on a rather serious dimension. Don't give in to temptation and sin. Your life is at stake, and James is writing this to Christians. Anyways, it's not God tempting you. It's your own desires. So that brings us full circle. Who blames God?
Oh.
Who does this?
Who?
Well, we do. We blame God when we blame anything other than ourselves for our temptations. We blame God when we don't recognize that our own desires are the source of our temptations. When we're tangling with a temptation, we can try to rationalize our choice to sin, and we can blame someone or something for what we're getting or not getting that we feel we should have, the way we want to get it. But God is sovereign, in control of all that stuff. He decides what we get and what we don't get. So blaming our circumstances is blaming Him. When the blame doesn't rest on our circumstances, the blame rests on us and our desires. There's this vivid illustration of temptation in Proverbs 7. There's a young man out at night, and this woman grabs hold of him and kisses him and invites him to join her in sin with her smooth speech. And the young man gives in to the temptation. The result is the same as in James: death. The young man is to blame. You could say it's the woman's fault for seducing him, or the woman's husband's fault for leaving his wife alone to go on his journey. Why did God allow those factors to play out like they did in this hypothetical situation in Proverbs? If only the situation would have been otherwise. The young man wouldn't have been tempted. No. The young man bears the blame. He was tempted with his own desires. So what's the solution? The prescription in Proverbs is the same as in James. The answer is wisdom. Just like it was for enduring trials. We need wisdom to recognize that our temptations come from our own desires, and we need wisdom to turn from them. Understand that sin is a process, and fight the battle against your desires before you lose by sinning. We alone bear the blame for our temptations. We aren't victims of forces beyond our control, just like Max and Moritz. Hey, thanks for watching the 6th video in this series on James. Make sure you like and subscribe. You can probably expect another video soon. Hey, maybe you know someone named Moritz, or maybe you even know a Max. Why not tell them about this excellent, high-quality video you just watched? Or you could just share it on social media with all your friends. Either way, I'll see you next time.